Let me ask you something. What if just one decision in the next 10 weeks could completely change crypto in the United States? Not years from now, not someday, weeks. Billions, maybe trillions are waiting. The biggest financial players are watching. And this single bill could decide who controls the next era of money. But here's the part no one is talking about. What's really holding it back isn't what you think. Welcome to Rula. This video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. That 10-week window isn't just a rough estimate, it's a hard deadline. Because before Congress breaks for the August recess, this bill has to clear multiple stages, starting with the Senate Banking Committee, then moving to a full Senate vote, followed by reconciliation with the House version, and finally reaching the president's desk. Miss that window, and everything resets. And that's what makes this so unusual. Legislation like this typically takes months, sometimes years, to move through all those steps. But this time, the timeline has been compressed into just a few weeks, which raises a bigger question. If this is the closest crypto regulation has ever been to actually passing, why does it suddenly feel like it might not make it in time? And the answer to that isn't as simple as political delays. At first glance, it's easy to assume this is just another case of political gridlock. Different parties, different priorities, nothing new. But that's not what's actually creating the biggest slowdown here, because some reports suggest the real resistance isn't coming from lawmakers at all. It's coming from outside the political arena, from institutions that have been part of the financial system for decades, long before crypto ever existed. And unlike politicians, these groups don't need votes to influence outcomes. They operate through pressure, relationships, and timing, quietly shaping how decisions unfold behind the scenes. Which starts to explain something that doesn't quite add up. If both sides in Congress are closer than ever to agreement, why is progress suddenly hitting friction right at the finish line? The answer begins to surface when you look at what's actually being debated. At the center of all this friction is one surprisingly technical question. Should stablecoins be allowed to generate yield? On the surface, it sounds minor, but in reality, it touches the core of how money moves and who benefits from it. Because if holding a digital dollar starts earning rewards, even in small amounts, it begins to look a lot like a bank account. And that's where concerns start to appear. Some reports suggest that certain banking groups are pushing for strict limits or even a full prohibition on any kind of yield tied to stablecoins. The argument is framed around consumer protection. If something behaves like a deposit, it should be regulated like one. But others see a different layer to this. If stablecoins can offer returns, even modest ones, they introduce direct competition to traditional accounts that typically offer very little in return. And that shifts incentives. Now add another detail. It has been reported that coordinated outreach efforts have taken place, encouraging opposition to the current compromise language, sometimes using pre-written messaging directed at policymakers. Not public campaigns, not open debates, but targeted communication designed to influence the outcome at a critical moment. And suddenly, this isn't just a technical disagreement anymore. It's a strategic one, because if this provision changes, it could reshape how competitive stablecoins really become. And that leads directly into a bigger question. What's actually at stake for the institutions pushing back? To understand the pushback, you have to look at how the current system actually works. Traditional banking doesn't just rely on holding deposits. It also generates massive revenue from things most people barely notice: overdraft fees, transfer charges, account maintenance costs. Individually, they seem small, but at scale, they add up to billions every year. Now imagine a different scenario. A system where moving money is faster, cheaper, and in some cases, even rewarding. That's the shift stablecoins introduce, and it's why this debate goes far beyond technical regulation. Because if users start moving funds into digital assets that offer more flexibility or even modest returns, it could slowly reduce reliance on traditional accounts. Not overnight, but over time. Some argue that the concerns being raised are about protecting consumers and maintaining stability, and that's a valid part of the conversation. But others suggest there's another layer, one tied to preserving existing revenue models that depend on how money is currently held and moved. Either way, the stakes are significant, because this isn't just about whether stablecoins can offer yield. It's about how competitive they're allowed to become. And once you see that, the resistance starts to make a lot more sense. But here's where things take another turn, because behind the scenes, a compromise may have already been reached. Here's what most people don't realize. The biggest fight over this bill may have already happened. Behind closed doors, negotiations brought together lawmakers, regulators, and industry representatives, trying to merge competing proposals into something that could actually pass. Not a perfect bill, a workable one. And according to reports from people involved in those discussions, that's exactly what they reached. A middle ground neither side fully liked, but both could move forward with. The stablecoin issue was part of that compromise. Instead of allowing unrestricted rewards, the language introduced limits, tying any potential benefits to specific conditions rather than making them automatic. A controlled approach, one that attempts to balance innovation with oversight. In other words, the concern that stablecoins might behave too much like bank accounts was already addressed, at least on paper, which makes what's happening now more confusing. Because even after those concessions, pressure hasn't eased. In fact, it's intensified. Some groups are still pushing to revisit parts of the agreement, trying to reopen discussions that were supposedly settled, and that creates a serious problem. Because with this kind of timeline, there isn't room to renegotiate everything again. So now the question isn't just what the bill says, it's whether the deal itself will hold long enough to make it through the system. And that's where timing becomes everything. Right now, the biggest obstacle isn't disagreement, it's timing. Because the full bill text still hasn't been released. And that might sound like a small detail, but it changes everything. Until that text is public, lawmakers can't fully review it, staff can't analyze it, and votes can't be locked in with confidence. Which means the entire process is effectively on hold. Some reports suggest this delay is intentional, because the last time a draft became public, it triggered a wave of reactions. Stakeholders pushing for changes, revisions piling up, and momentum slowing almost instantly. This time, there may not be room for that. The strategy appears different. Keep the text tight, finalize the details privately, and only release it when it's ready to move. No long debates, no drawn-out revisions, just a straight path to a vote. But that approach comes with risk, because every day the text stays hidden is a day lost from an already shrinking timeline. And with the August deadline closing in, there's almost no margin left for delays, which leads to a much bigger question. If this doesn't move in time, what happens to everything riding on it? If this bill actually makes it through in time, the impact won't be subtle. It changes how the entire market operates. Because right now, one of the biggest barriers in crypto isn't technology, it's uncertainty. No clear rules on what qualifies as a security. No consistent framework for exchanges. No reliable guidelines for institutions managing large capital. And when rules aren't clear, money stays on the sidelines. But that flips the moment clarity comes in. Institutions that have been waiting suddenly have a framework to operate within. Retail investors who stepped back during uncertainty have a reason to return. Exchanges can list assets with more confidence. Projects can build without constantly worrying about regulatory risk. And liquidity, real liquidity, starts flowing again. Not driven by hype, but by structure. Assets like XRP are often mentioned in this context, not because the bill targets them directly, but because clearer classification could remove long-standing uncertainty around similar digital assets. And when that kind of clarity enters the market, it doesn't just affect one project. It reshapes the entire ecosystem. But here's the part that makes this moment critical. If the bill misses this window, that clarity doesn't just get delayed. It disappears into an uncertain future. And that changes everything. So this is where everything stands. A bill years in the making, now compressed into a 10-week sprint. The groundwork is there, the compromise exists, and by most accounts, the finish line is closer than it's ever been. But the outcome is still uncertain, because what happens next doesn't just depend on what's written in the bill. It depends on whether it moves fast enough to survive the clock. If it does, the United States could set the tone for how digital assets are regulated globally. Clear rules, defined boundaries, and a system that finally gives both builders and investors a stable foundation to operate on. But if it doesn't, the entire process resets. Momentum fades, and the next opportunity may come under conditions that are far less predictable, which makes this moment different from anything before it. This isn't just another step in the evolution of crypto. It's a decision point, one that could shape where innovation happens, where capital flows, and who leads the next phase of the financial system. And with only weeks left, that decision is coming fast. So when you zoom out, this isn't just about one bill moving through Congress. It's about timing, pressure, and a system that's being forced to evolve faster than it's used to. Because for years, crypto has existed in this uncertain space, growing rapidly, attracting attention, but never fully anchored by clear rules. And that uncertainty has had real consequences. Projects hesitating to launch, companies moving operations offshore, capital waiting on the sidelines instead of flowing into the market. All because one fundamental question still hasn't been answered. Where exactly are the boundaries? That's what the Clarity Act is trying to define. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to shift the direction. And that's why this moment feels different. Because for the first time, it's not just discussion. It's not early-stage proposals or theoretical frameworks. It's a real, actionable path, with a deadline attached to it. At the same time, the resistance we're seeing also tells its own story. Whenever a system starts to change, the parts that benefit most from the current structure tend to push back the hardest. That doesn't automatically make them wrong, but it does explain why progress becomes more difficult right when it matters most. And that's exactly where things are right now. Right at the edge of moving forward, or slipping back into uncertainty. Because if this passes, it doesn't just impact regulation, it changes confidence. And confidence is what drives participation. It's what brings institutions into the market. It's what encourages builders to create. It's what allows innovation to happen without constantly looking over its shoulder. But if it stalls, that uncertainty lingers. And in markets, uncertainty has a cost. It slows momentum. It redirects capital. And sometimes it shifts entire industries to other parts of the world that are moving faster. So this isn't just about whether crypto gets clearer rules in the US. It's about whether the US chooses to lead that process or react to it later. And that decision doesn't stretch out over years. It's happening right now, quietly, behind negotiations, timelines, and details most people never see. Which is why this is one of those moments worth paying attention to. Because by the time the outcome is obvious, the opportunity to shape it will already be gone. And whatever happens next won't just define crypto regulation. It will define where the next wave of financial innovation actually takes place. The content is for educational and informational purposes only, and should not be considered financial, investment, or legal advice. Cryptocurrency markets involve significant risk. Always do your own research. See you in the next video.